On the fall day of November 11th, 1620, the Pilgrims ended their long journey of 66 days on the Mayflower ship as they docked in Massachusetts off the coast of what we now know as Cape Cod. They landed in the New World for a fresh start and religious freedom. About 41% of those who traveled were separatists seeking religious freedom from the church in England.
They decided to stay in Massachusetts and sign the Mayflower Compact on the ship, the foundation for their new government. In December, they anchored the Mayflower at Plymouth Harbor and began to form a colony.
Although the Pilgrims made it to America, their journey was hard. The Pilgrims faced many challenges when arriving and in the early years of building their colony.
When the Pilgrims finally began to settle, it was December, which means a cold New England winter. They were tasked with building their shelter as they were arriving at nothing. Some colonists began to build shelter, while the rest of the passengers stayed aboard the ship while their houses were being built. In March of 1621, they began to move off the Mayflower and settle permanently. Unfortunately, not everybody was there to see the colony. Many passengers became sick on board between the harsh winter, poor and/or lack of nutrition, and illness. In the first year, only 52 of around the 100 Mayflower passengers survived.
The Pilgrims began to build their houses in the cold winter. They brought with them the tools they needed and used materials from the land to build. They chopped down wood, used grasses, clay, and earth to set up their houses. The houses took 2 to 3 months to build and were not very large, as they hoped to make better ones down the road when they had their own land. Most houses only had one room and were dark. Some had a loft for storage. Their new houses were very different from the ones they left behind in England, and definitely not as comforting.
Along with shelter, the Pilgrims needed to figure out a food supply. They had never farmed in England before, as they would get their food from shops. Now they had to learn how to grow their own food. The climate in New England was also different than in England. It was not an easy task and took a lot of learning. It was a job that required around-the-clock work as they hoped for a good harvest. The Native Americans also showed them how to grow things such as native corn. The Pilgrims brought some animals from England to have dairy products, and the shellfish off the coast of Massachusetts was plentiful. They could even hunt for animals when they wanted. Farming was hard, but the Pilgrims began to grow a harvest. They had to learn a whole new way of getting their food.
After finding a way to get their basic needs of food and water met, the Pilgrims had to adapt to their new environment. No familiar faces were there to welcome them when they arrived on shore. They were unfamiliar with the land and had to learn their way around. They had to learn where water sources were, different landmarks, and familiarize themselves with their new home. There were no shops, no doctors, nothing of what felt familiar from England. The Pilgrims had to start from scratch with adjusting to the new land and forming their colony.
The Pilgrims were not alone, though. Native Americans, specifically the Wampanoag, had already been living on this land. They had to figure out how to live in peace and work with them. Soon, a Native American named Tisquantum, also known as Squanto, helped act as a translator, as he was captured and spent time in England. Massasoit was also a leader and who they worked closely with to form a relationship. The Pilgrims negotiated peace treaties with the Wampanoag so that they could live in peace together. The Native Americans helped the Pilgrims harvest and get accustomed to this new land. The Pilgrims worked to live in peace with the Native Americans.
As discussed, learning to farm was a difficult task for the Pilgrims. In the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated their first successful harvest with what we now call the first Thanksgiving. This marked a celebration of struggle they had faced. They had learned and were taught how to farm. and now they could celebrate.
Since they were landing in a new environment and starting from scratch, the Pilgrims needed a way to self-govern. They did not land in Virginia as planned, and therefore did not have rules and laws, as they did not have a patent for this land. As a way to start, the Pilgrims wrote the Mayflower Compact. The short document was written and then signed on the Mayflower on November 11th when they landed. Some of the document included statements such as they would remain loyal under King James, constitute and enact equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, and they would live under God. 41 men signed the compact, hoping to establish civil order in this new land. They had to figure out a way to have their own form of self-government, and they knew they had to rely on each other to keep a community.
Religion played a major role in why many of the Pilgrims came to New England. Arriving at a place with no familiar faces, they would have to work to keep a community. In a place where they only knew each other, church helped them build that community. The church building held no meaning to the Pilgrims. The church setting was very plain and had no religious symbols or decorations. The church building was located underground in the town's fort. The Pilgrims go to church on Sundays. This was all so that they could focus on their faith and each other. Even the governor would join.
Although the Pilgrims faced many challenges when arriving in Plymouth, they eventually began to settle into their new lives, with many other people following behind them to settle. Their voyage allowed them to create the first colonial settlement in New England.
Since they had begun to create a settlement, it allowed for settlers to keep coming from England. More people traveling allowed the colony to slowly grow. 4 years after landing, in 1624, Plymouth Colony had a population of 124 people. In 1637, it was up to 549 people. Not only was Plymouth growing, but so were the areas around it. By 1643, 9 additional towns were settled. The Pilgrims and those who came over were breaking off into small groups that could self-sustain. In 1691, the population of Plymouth Colony reached about 7,000 people. It was at this time that Plymouth Colony became a part of the much more prosperous Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Even though they established a settlement, the Pilgrims still continue to struggle with Plymouth Colony through its existence. They were able to be self-sufficient, but never had a wealthy economy. As more settlers came, that meant they were looking for more land. This led to failing relations with the Native Americans that they worked to build up. There were many acts of violence that continued to add up over the years. It got so bad that in 1675, King Philip's War broke out. As Plymouth Colony began to decline, that is when they became one with Massachusetts Bay Colony.
When arriving in 1620, the Pilgrims stood in front of many challenges that faced them. Between diseases, harsh winters, learning to grow food, build homes, and sustain a self-government, among many other things, the Pilgrims were able to form their own colony. Although Plymouth Colony began to decline, it was still the first colonial settlement in New England. Visitors can even visit Plymouth Plantation, the living museum, to observe what being a pilgrim was like. So, would you like to have been a pilgrim?